restart. And it's kind of obvious in the current time that the way to start is the COVID and the city, right? But I do want to mention a couple of things. These are obvious things, totally obvious, because how can we not talk about it? And perhaps at some point I'll ask you, are you revising your academic program, your curriculum? How can you not talk about COVID as we proceed, both in practice and in academia? But that's a different topic. But COVID and the city, unfortunate companions. In Ashish Nandi's word, intimate enemy. But the indictment is on the city. I was writing something, and a line I want to refer to you, that we are now living in the city, and people are living in other places, but many of us, you and I, are living in the city, are also retreating from the city, like we have isolated ourselves. This is unbearable, at least for me, living in the city and retreated from the city. So that is one. And I just read an article recently by, well, you will never guess, in the New York Times, Jerry Seinfeld. I don't know if you have caught your attention. And the topic is, so you think New York is dead? He was responding to another article. I'll not name the person. He doesn't name the person also, but this other person in a very, very elaborate way saying, the city is dead. New York City is dead or dying. He says business is dead, culture is dead, food is dead. People are fleeing. You can't just right now ignore these things. But what I want to say is, Jerry Seinfeld, he has become an urbanist, so you might want to look him up. He has a one-line manifesto, or 2 lines, I think. And he's saying, real, live, inspiring human energy exists when we coagulate together in crazy places like New York City. That's 1 line. And then in response to this other person, he's saying, oh, you think Rome is going away too? London, Tokyo, New York? They are not. They change, they mutate, they reform. So that's what he said. But I was wondering, do we have a post-COVID thinking here? Or it's not even post-COVID, we are right in the middle of it.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think there are many ways you can pick up that provocation. And, we've all thought about it in the context of our own existences. I mean, I think the thing that has been going through my mind a lot in the context of your provocation is, I mean, the way I would frame it is, for me, in my mind, there's a tension, and I think you put it very well, this frustration of being in the city and not being able to access it. And the way I've sort of been thinking about it is to evoke Satyajit Ray and the film and all of that is, the home and the world, how the relationship between our home and our world is altering. The home if we, and of course, this is a matter of what age you're at and what phase of your life you're at. But I think for all of us, I can say this for you as much as I can say it for me, just because of our bilocational existence, etc., is the home had actually become a very transient place. Because the access we had to the world and the access we had to the city and the access we had at this phase of our life of engaging with people, and the world was what was surrounding us. There was this illusion, Maya, that the world was the stable entity and the home was transient. Very fast, that has flipped completely. The home has become the most stable place. I was struck by the fact that you, Kazi, I've never heard you talk like this. You're actually relating your thought process to the temperature of your toes. So you're becoming so, you're feeling and touching your home in ways you've never done before. You have taken it for granted. It has been the transient space in your life. Now the world has become transient and the home has become the most stable entity. And by extension, I mean the locality. We are noticing more things in our neighborhoods. We are noticing more things across the street. We are noticing more things in our backyard, etc. And so this sort of it's an interesting tension. I mean, you can't see it as a binary. It has never been a binary. The home in the world is always a evolving tension and an evolving and shifting set of relationships in the way you place your home within the world, right? Now that tension has taken on a completely different dimension because the presence of the home, the tactility of the home, the changing light qualities, the minute details that we weren't absorbing as much as we should have been, have become what are informing even our intellectual makeup about perceptions, about life, about many other things. And so I think in the same way, one could argue that you can morph this into local global, you can morph this into many binaries that we have used in ways to understand architecture and explain it and explain our own position on certain issues. But I mean, I think in this kind of pandemic world, there's a kind of leveling, there's a flattening. There is also a greater visibility of some structural and very inherent problems, whether it's questions of inequity, because these inequities have now even got heightened just because in the way people are affected, because now the test has become life and death. And, we know through facts and science that in poorer communities, there's a greater impact of this, etc. But I think more importantly, I think that inequity also gets manifest in the way the value of the home suddenly has taken on another dimension. The ones like you and me who are blessed to be secure in our homes are being able to even operate and engage in a kind of intellectual discourse like this, because we have that security just because we are blessed. But I think that lack of access to home has increased its preciousness in everybody's lives. And so these are evolving, changing, but become very evident relationships in terms of this inversion that's occurring in that relationship between the home and the world, and by extension, our locality and the world. And then I don't know how you extend that locality into what is hometown or what is, other definitions in terms of how you articulate them.
Right. No, I mean, on the one hand, as you say, it's a reversal, possibly, but it's also a contraction. It's not only that it's home and the world, home has become the world.
The world,
right?
Yeah.
And in that sense, right now, as you mentioned, that we're now looking at home as a geography, that all those sort of little things we have overlooked, they have become like really significant before our eyes. As you said, temperature in the toes, the little crack in the veranda floor, right? On the wall, are things that we have noticed, the cobwebs, all those things are, it's like Gaston Bachelard in a like really unique, intensive way. And I think that's also a project, kind of a real revival, sort of an appraisal of home. If you like, if home is the world, then a real appraisal of home. And I don't mean in a sort of, in a sort of aesthetical / geographical sense, but also social sense. As you mentioned, that not for everybody, home is available the way perhaps you and I have, luckily. As we know that domestic violence has increased, all kind of abuses have increased, and I can't imagine in many places, in like warmer, humid places, how can one be restricted 10 people in one room? And in fact, in New York City, as you know, that for many immigrants, the COVID cases have risen because there were like 20 people living in 2 rooms. So that sort of thing. Right. So, and now
I just want to interject there. I think you framed it quite, in an interesting way. And I think I meant it like that. I'm sorry if I didn't communicate it like that. Is that, it's none of this is simplistic. You can't explain them as binaries. You can't explain them as simple reversals. These are new formations and tensions and relationships that are evolving on a temporal scale, on a seasonal scale, within the period of the pandemic. It's just that I think our acute awareness of even the existence of these categories, as we describe as the home and the world, and that relationship is suddenly, we are being forced, we are being provoked to, in our own minds, attach an understanding and a set of values to it, which we kind of had taken, for many of us, we had taken for granted.
Many of us. And for many of us, in fact, it's not just home and the world in the literal physical sense that you could go out and go get a cup of coffee. Even right now, getting a cup of coffee could be fatal. You know, that's what I'm thinking, that I haven't had espresso outside in 5 months.
Yeah.
I mean, not a big deal, but I'm saying that even just going out and doing the simple thing like doing grocery could be fatal.
Yeah.
But that's at the, that's what
in fact, imagine, and now you might have an orbit which might say, and his love for double espressos finally killed him.
Could be. I had a lovely double espresso, but I'm dead. Right. No, I was saying that I also I was fortunate to live in Honolulu. And, you know, with the weather is an important thing here, you know, how you negotiate with home and world. I used to, live in my home or apartment, and I would just walk out anytime. And I would mentally think that I'm going out there in the park, it's my living room. Or I would go out next to the water, it's my deck. So the whole city kind of inflated as an extension of the home. And for many, I would say that even becomes treacherous. So we have to kind of renegotiate what I call the spatial reach of the body. You know, that has been curtailed. And then, prior to this, the spatial reach, we would not think twice about doing certain things, but now every moment is calibrated, right? Every footsteps we take, everything that we touch is calibrated, and it becomes.
And the consequences are also anticipated.
That's right. Now, for you and me, okay, again, we're lucky that we live in 2 cities, 3 cities. Now that is curtailed, like Rahul. Right now I'm in Philadelphia. So home and the world being the city, this particular city for you, that particular city, Boston, that's also restricted in one way. And of course, the other reach for which you have to use an airplane, that's off right now. So, all right. So I don't know. What are urban designers and planners thinking right now? Will there be a kind of viral urbanism topic, an epidemical urbanism coming up in the horizon? Public health come up? Public health has been always on the side of urban planning, but now will it come in the forefront for a while?
For a while. That's a good qualification. But I think you have to look at cities in the long durée. You have to look at it historically. There have been plagues before. Cities like Mumbai got emptied out. Many other cities were affected in other ways. You've had world wars which have created devastations. And of course, each of these leave a trace. They leave a trace of some kind. It's very hard to, I believe, and I think it's presumptuous for us to think from a disciplinary perspective that the silver bullet exists because our disciplines are going to look at the world differently, or because of our disciplines are going to look at the city differently, right? So you could argue the world wars had a different effect in different parts. In America, and I don't think it's a singular reason it propelled the suburbs, but there were many other forces that aligned to allow that narrative to propel the suburbs. And you could argue that fundamentally altered the form of the city, right?
Right.
But these are multiplicity of forces where certain events trigger off their coalescing together to get more traction to make something happen. Yeah. So, for example, you could argue that the world wars and then the American paranoia, but also that aligned with investments in freeways. It also aligned with the invention of the motor car and its affordability. It also aligned with the GIs coming back. It also aligned with, the narrative of the American dream. So many things converged post-World War to propel a certain shift, let's say, in the urban form of American cities, correct? Now, that necessarily didn't happen in Europe so much. In Europe, the reaction was the other extent, rebuild in situ. And Dresden was rebuilt with every detail of its old glory, in a sense, right? And so these reactions are completely different. Now, with the pandemic, I'm not sure what the reaction is going to be. Of course, density is being named as a culprit, which is not right, because it's not about just density, it's about amenities, it's about ventilation, it's about many things that you can solve even with densities. And this is proved in our countries. In many parts, people have managed this better in spite of the densities. Climate is affecting it, not affecting it. So I don't know. I think, I think the thing that I'm at least personally very cautious about is the one solution or the one response. I believe very much that this will play itself out very differently in different cultural contexts, in different geographies, and in different economies, let's say. So I think one has to very much situate the question in a particular locality. And this is where, again, I think, from what we have experienced and the way we've even informed our thinking about urbanism in the last 2 decades, where there has been an implicit arrogance about formations being more universalized. It's almost like the modernist kind of thinking. I think this is a moment where, if anything, I think locality becomes very important again, because a lot of these solutions, I think, will be very much tied. And you could argue that's been always a condition. It's going to be tied very much to localities very specifically.
I agree, but on the other hand, I have like two thoughts here. One is, and even if you look at Europe, prior to the wars, 19th century, it was actually public health issues that led to the formation of what we call modern planning. And I now argue not only
including
modern
pollution,
planning,
which led to zoning and all that.
That's right. And not only modern planning, but modern architecture itself, this whole sort of, the white cubic, the sanatorium-like language of the architecture. And a lot of people are talking about that now. So it's a revision of what early modern architecture is all about. So that's on the one hand. So fundamental shifts may happen. We don't know. Perhaps that's another area to predict or work on. But also some things that you have said, I can't but wonder that there are a number of items here that may come up in a much more intensive way. One is public space. Okay, the formation of public space, how we traverse public spaces, that's one. The other is the density of cities, as you mentioned, or density of neighborhoods, or density of localities, whether we will be giving very extra attention to that. Third is footprint of the city, and I think that's for me very important. Footprint, and especially I'm thinking of cities in South Asia, cities in Bangladesh. And as may have happened in China, the footprint and its excursion into areas which may call forest or nature or wilderness, that sort of very violent conjunction of two very different systems. We haven't given it much attention, but perhaps this whole business of the footprint of the city, whether it needs. So in a sense, maybe density would be better. You curtail the footprint and you just don't keep on expanding mindlessly, endlessly, as is happening in many of our cities in South Asia. So yes, and on that note, perhaps if we can discuss what architects and urban designers can do here, because those are the disciplines that we work with, whether it may seem a bit fantastical to talk about what can architects do, right? What can architects do in what I now call rearranging the city? You're not planning the city or all that, but rearranging the city. I emphasize that because architects or urban designers can shy away from that project of planning / rearranging the city because it's just too much, or it's really out of my scope. And it's a megalomaniacal to think that one could do that. But on the other hand, cities are changing furiously. I can talk about Dhaka, maybe you can talk about Mumbai, changing furiously every second. It's being engineered or choreographed at many levels, and private investors, developers, from that level to the level of the pawn shop guy who is doing little changes on the sidewalk every day. So what appears then as a futile task, or may appear as a futile task to architects, I don't know whether we have to take this up seriously, rearranging the city. As the things that we do at Bengal Institute and the kind of agenda that I have now set up for myself and our group, that's the task, rearranging the city. You can't shy away from that. In whatever framework you articulate that, whatever works for you. And you mentioned very clearly locality is important. You work with the local condition, but I think rearranging the city. And I think it reflects on other things, not only rearranging the city in a kind of infrastructural way, space, public realm, that sort of thing, but also the question of inequity, how things are problematic at that level. So what should architects be thinking about?
But
maybe, Rahul, maybe at this point, maybe you want to talk about your book also, because you titled it Practicing in Mumbai. Is that what you meant?
Working in Mumbai.
Working in Mumbai. I think it's relevant. You mentioned it, working in Mumbai. It's already kind of sets you up with Mumbai, your intimate relationship with Mumbai. So what can architects do?
So yeah, I can just use that as a slight segue, but yeah, so maybe now that you've mentioned it, I'll sort of explain it a little bit, because I think it'll help me answer your question. And I think for what you use as the word rearranging, cities, it resonates very deeply for the same reasons. So, the reason I kind of titled the book Working in Mumbai was a few reasons. One is becoming more aware 3 decades later after practice, the bearing that the city actually had on not only the model of our practice, but also the spectrum and the nature of things that we got involved with. But also by extension, it became a relationship with the city, which again, we feel blessed that we gave to the city generously and the city gave back to us very generously. And it's a relationship where, that's why I call it working in Mumbai, because it's active. It is about trying to grapple with change that you're talking about. It's trying to it forced the question of what is our agency, even as architecture, as architects, what is our relationship to society, and what does society do for us? What are we to do for society? What does society invest in us as architects to imagine better spatial possibilities where people can live their lives? So that kind of, one became very aware, and as you know, this is where maybe our trajectories were slightly different, is I kind of went back right after I graduated from here. We were contemporaries in the Boston area. And I actually didn't even use my passport for a whole decade till you and James invited me for that conference in New York. That was the first time
Really?
I left India. I had only gone to Bhutan, and I didn't need my passport to go to Bhutan. And so, yeah, and so it was, and I often say this, it was that New York conference that I came to where you were talking about the next generation of modernists in South Asia or something, right? That was more, you did it running with your exhibition. And for me, that was actually an amazing moment. And
wow, Rahul, wow, I'm responsible for your...
let me finish. So let me finish. No, let me finish. So I was literally working in Mumbai for, I would say, a decade. That conference was 96, correct?
96, yes. 97.
Yeah, so it was 97. So it was exactly 10 years. I graduated in 87 and I didn't leave the country. I had no aspirations to leave the country. I think it was just because of your invitation that I came to speak. And I felt like Rip Van Winkle, because I felt I had kind of missed a decade of discourse on architecture and urbanism in the West. Actually, I'm glad for it, because I might have been caught up in the post-structuralist discourse if I had actually stayed on, or I might have been influenced by things differently. But the deep immersion in a place for 10 years without the aspiration of actually even leaving, I had no intent, I had no motivation to want to leave. when I look back, and that's the kind of thing I've recapped in this book, it was a very important decade because it established very complex relationships with the city, and by extension with people, with constituencies, with citizens, with governments, with all sorts of things. Yeah, and that had a huge bearing on our practice, which then began to take on advocacy, research. It began to, you know, do buildings, do conservation, do repair, all sorts of things. So I think your framing of rearranging, for me, was something that was actually happening in the nature of our practice, where for us, conservation, recycling, repair, new buildings all had an equal bearing. Because one began to understand that cities grow in two ways. I might be simplifying this a little bit. They grow by either expanding and colonizing land in the hinterland, that means on their peripheries, which can happen organically, or it can happen in a planned manner, which is what, say, the idea of New Bombay was about. Or cities grow by recycling land or rearranging the landscape within their own existing organisms, right? And I think we have tended to, as society and as professionals and the narratives, to do one or the other. The simultaneous validity of both these moves is also very critical, because often you have to engage with both those modes, which actually stretches us as professionals in terms of our engagements, because designing tabula rasa, designing extensions, designing, you know, colonization of hinterlands is one kind of activity and imagination, but rearranging an existing landscape by recycling land, by attributing new uses, sets up all sorts of complex new relationships with sometimes unintended consequences. And so these are forms of practice which I think we need to take more seriously if we have to have relevance in society, because it allows us a whole spectrum of engagement, which designing, you know, something afresh is a completely different endeavor. And I think we have to, and that's why I think what you're saying about rearranging resonates very deeply, is because the idea of repair, the idea of recycling, the idea of readaptation, the idea of rearrangement, the idea of taking an existing problem, albeit sometimes a wicked problem, and kind of opening up possible ways of reformulation of even the question, should be given as much premium if we have to, in many parts of the world, operate effectively or have agency. Let me put it. I mean, I'm using agency in a very positive way. Otherwise, we are going to lack agency. And I think that's beginning to happen. I mean, how many more new cities will we build in China that will keep architects globally active? Not at all. So therefore, it's going to become about repair. It's going to be about refixing and reimagining and repairing and rearranging these huge landscapes that we have colonized, because otherwise we're going to heighten our conflicts with nature too, because the footprint question comes in, and all of that. And so I think not only on account of the pandemic, but the pandemic might be, I'm coming back now to your first question, the pandemic might become the trigger where the confluence of the contingencies that we are now facing on account of climate change, on account of densities we've created by default, etc. The pandemic might become the trigger where this new imaginary might emerge. And I think one way of imagining this new imaginary is through the rubric of rearrangement, as you have very well articulated.
Okay, no, great. No, I think I would like to pick up on just that one notion, imagination. I think many of us, you certainly, and I in my own way, have found out or created different forms of practice. And I think that's a whole new topic that we can discuss at another point, maybe with some other group, forms of practice. Especially in our context, where in some sense the situation is still also open-ended in how practices can be formulated. I personally, I think for me, writing is a practice. And I think from day one, it was very, very important and critical for myself, firstly. And then when I published, whoever read it or gave it any importance, I don't know. Not many people are giving writing any importance. That's what architects do. But that's not going to stop me. Because I think writing and thinking are, for me, a very fundamental part of practice. It's not like theory and writing are one thing and practice is another thing. Writing is a form of practice. Thinking is a form of practice. Imagination is a form of practice. And then within the more dedicated idea of practice, of course, and I really like the notion of repair. And I really want to think of repair in multiple ways, and one could, it's not just placing a couple of bricks.
Kazi, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second.
Yes.
One other word that I forgot to use is maintenance. Because maintenance falls after repair. I should have used that word. And it also is something that we need to bring into our education, actually.
Sure. I mean, I think repair is a beautiful word. One could do a whole symposium on repair at some point, but I think I would like to think about, at this point, imagination and imaginary. And I would like to say a few things here, Rahul, and see what you think. The urban imaginary, the city imaginary in the South Asian context, in which will include India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka. I don't know. The city narrative or urban narrative has kind of settled on urbanization. And I'm not saying I reject urbanization, but I don't see urbanism. So there is a kind of, this is really a dichotomy, urbanization and urbanism. Our policymakers, the developers don't talk about urbanism. That doesn't make any sense as the word urbanism circulates in European or American context. I say this because urbanization tends to have this crisis connotation to it. Urbanization means a crisis, things out of control, pollution, traffic, that's urbanization. How can we get out of this, and how can we break out of this mold and think of the city as a kind of consciousness, which Henri Lefebvre, that's a phrase, city as a consciousness. So a more, let's say in a simple way, positive twist to cities. And in the various urban city narratives in around South Asia, I don't see a big move away from what's perhaps it's a disaster narrative or an ecological or economic narrative and a sociological narrative. I don't see that. And I say that, I'll just say that there's no kind of James Joyce or Italo Calvino around the city in South Asia. And maybe R.K. Narayan Malgudi is one, but which is around like more smaller towns. Now, and I had been looking this very closely. So Salman Rushdie, for example, and here I'll say a few things. Amitav Ghosh, for example, his book Shadow Lines, it kind of goes back and forth between Dhaka, Kolkata, and London, sort of the urban base. And you get the grains of urban spaces and the city in those writings. But I want to mention Rushdie for one reason. Let me see. In his
You've quoted him extensively in your...
not quote. Yes, I did. So I'd like to mention one line.
The house of the Bougainvillea.
Exactly. So here is Salman Rushdie, who is a sort of a deep, dark critique of the nation state as it come to be. He wants to, I'm not saying he wants to dismantle the nation, but he wants to do a very harsh critique of the nation. And that's how he is seen. And The Midnight's Children is a sort of a, I would say, allegory of the nation. That's how the book is seen. But the city plays a big role in a very surreptitious way. For example, the first line of the book, and this is what I'm quoting to you: I was born in the city of Bombay once upon a time. So, well, yes, I was born in the city of Bombay. And then there are other lines there, especially the Bougainvillea, which is in the other book, Imaginary Homelands. And then in the Imaginary Homelands, there is one text where he returns to Mumbai after his exile and all that. And then I don't know if that exists yet in Mumbai, the telephone book. And but at that time, or maybe that was late 80s.
But the house he describes yet exists.
Right, okay. But in the telephone book, he finds the name of his father, and that he finds moving. So no matter how Salman Rushdie, which is, I'm just mentioning one person here, who is sort of the great articulator of the nation and its sort of various fault lines and what have you, he is so much devoted to this one particular city, Mumbai. And he does say when he moves to New York that he lives in two cities, New York and Mumbai, even if he cannot go there. So that's not yet the kind of imaginary that I'm talking about, but I don't know if you will agree with me that the kind of imagination about cities that we might perhaps see in other places. We have reduced the city as a kind of crisis.
No, that's very interesting. And, you know, I don't know whether you know.
No, let me, Rahul, just add one more thing before I
sorry.
forget.
Okay. I thought you finished, yeah.
Right. The reluctant appearance of the city in literary sociological narratives, because I'm interested in, and also cinematic narratives. Maybe in cinematic narratives, we can talk about that, you know. So in the film, you know, the city does appear, and I do make a big point about it. One book is very of much interest to me is Kuratulain Haidar's River of Fire. That's also Dhaka, East Bengal, Bihar, Delhi. It's like a sweeping novel because I want to track this narratives, you know, where the city appears. But what I'm finally saying, the city appears reluctantly. It's in the backdrop. If we want to talk about city as the world, it's a backdrop. So in the urban discourse, the discourse of the city, not urban discourse on the city, which is fundamentally taken over by an economic, or at best, sustainability argument, you know, I'm looking forward to a new kind of imagination. And I think whether the COVID or not will fast forward that or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Oh my gosh, too much.
Yeah.
Too much on the table, Kazi.
On the table, like, no, that's
so let me kind of
let's boil it down. Let us boil it down. If you want to talk about this urbanization, I want to explore this with you. Urbanization versus urbanism.
I'll respond to all of it. So you know, just to preface it, and I'm going to kind of respond backwards, is for whatever it's worth, I mean, it's just lovely to hear you bring all these up, because when I was graduating at the JSD, my thesis was called One Space, Two Worlds. And my whole thesis was based on Midnight's Children. And where my argument was, I mean, I used Midnight's Children. So I had pages from Midnight's Children, and then I argued that that was looking at the city through the lens of a writer and through this kind of magic realism mode. And then what does one see as a planner from that? You know, how do you make that bridge? And it was a very, for me, it was a very, I mean, it was a raw, uncooked thesis. I don't even know if I have a copy anywhere. But it was very fundamental in my own thinking, coming back to the idea of why I call the book Working in Mumbai. And here's what I kind of got to learn from it. For me, the book was very moving because, you know, it was, I mean, he was talking about essentially South Bombay. It was a Bombay that I grew up in. The characters he mentions there, I knew of as friends of friends of friends of parents. The house he describes, I lived 100 yards from that growing up for 2 years, and my father was in a job. I mean, it was an apartment of a company we were in. So I knew that street so intimately as he described it. So there were many things that kind of resonated. And so basically what I did was I kind of understood doing that work that different disciplines, including literature and including poetry, including photography, you know, these are lenses that have a very particular filter that they apply. And therefore, sometimes through those filters, you can see many things that you and I as an architect might not see, or someone as a planner might not see, correct? So those filters are fantastic. So for example, for me, Raghuveer Singh's book, the essay that I dealt with you, I shared with you, called Kinetic City.
Right.
That was very much fueled by Raghuveer Singh's book on Bombay, and having many personal conversations with him about why he was selecting particular kinds of images, you know. And so the whole idea that I've expressed in Kinetic City, where architecture is not the spectacle of the city and festivals become the new spectacle of the city, came out. I mean, it didn't come out directly, but it was inspired by my many conversations with Raghuveer Singh when he was putting the Ganesh festival on the cover of the book versus some fantastic skyline of Mumbai, because he was at that time very much influenced by Naipaul. He had been going with Naipaul, and Naipaul did the forward for his book. Naipaul was writing Million Mutinies now, which means they were interviewing people in the slums who were supporting the Shiv Sena. You know, there was a whole lot of political, which made Raghuveer see the city. So Raghuveer was using the lens of literary writing to have a lens on the city, which then he took his photography lens and applied another one to the city. Then I'm trying to use his lens of photography to understand another dimension of the city in my writing about the city, right? So I think this is why I think what you rightly say, urbanism is very important, and I'll come back to it for a second. So the city,
or some
is
other
observed,
word that we can cook up.
Correct, exactly. So the city is looked at through different lenses, and our lens that we are equipped with as architects, urbanists, is one lens. Yeah, we have to be less dogmatic about that lens, but we have to also find ways that we can make the bridge between the reading of the city through these multiple lenses and the core agency that we have as designers, right? Often that is the gap that we can't successfully build. And I know those are the kinds of aspirations that you even have at the Bengal Institute, right? So the way I've begun to kind of describe this, and this is again something I write about quite extensively in the book Working in Mumbai, is that, you know, when we get caught with the narrative of urbanization, now I'm coming pointedly to your question, it is about action. It is about, it's a very active voice there, correct? It's urbanized, it's something that's happening. Therefore, it then extends into crisis mode, right? It's a process. It's like Turner describing housing as a process. It's a verb. And so urbanization then begins to, and especially in the parts of the world that we come from, it begins to imply a crisis situation because urbanization is happening so quickly, right? Whereas urbanism, on the other hand, is about observing a condition and learning from it. That is, having, almost in a funny way, within the crisis that we exist in South Asia, having the luxury to view the world through Lefebvre and through Raghuveer Singh, through Naipaul, through Rushdie, through Amitabh Ghosh. There's a luxury, and therefore, if one wants to be critical of that, I'm not, because I have learned, that's why I shared with you how much I've been inspired by that mode, is that we are then susceptible as actors on the ground that, oh, you're academic, you're enjoying the luxury of seeing Salman Rushdie be critical of the nation state through the city and all of that. So there's a kind of gap between those two modes. So the way I've begun to start framing it in my own work and my thinking is, which is what I've written about in this book, is, you know, we extend urbanization into advocacy, which means the way we act then is we begin to say, okay, my God, how do we fix it? How do we upgrade that slum? How do we bring in that? How do we do this? How do we do that? And we become part of that frenzy of urbanization without seeing it. Correct?
Right.
We become surfers on the wave without understanding what the wave is and what is the dynamic of the wave. Correct? And so the way I situate now my writings on the city, some of which are things like walking tours of historic areas, some of which is legislation, some of which is a description of the city, I'm beginning to call them instruments of advocacy. And I feel places like the Bengal Institute, the Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai, the Academy, should become much more mindful that it's not, you don't have to be conscious that you're not acting with good morality if you're not acting, correct? Because you can also contribute to the process of advocacy by creating the instruments for advocacy. And I believe the instruments for advocacy is where we make the bridge between urbanism and urbanization, because we begin to provide new lenses to our own agency through our own disciplinary learning, but beginning to draw nourishment from the multiple lenses that might be able to see, help us see the wave that we are surfing on differently, correct? And so I think it's as critical as practice. So writing is practice. I totally believe in that. That's again a whole chapter I've dedicated in this book about the notion of writing is practice. But I'm extending it further to say it is about also this responsibility that we have as practitioners and agents in society, that society has invested in it, to create the instruments for advocacy. It doesn't always have to be advocacy. And the same people who are advocates on the ground need not be the same people who make those instruments for advocacy. This can be also detached. Of course, they have to have synergies and there's information. And that's why I think platforms like the Bengal Institute, from at least what I understand you're doing, what we are trying to do in the UDRI, is precisely create these platforms where urbanism, urbanization, instruments of advocacy and the processes of advocacy can actually have a healthy conversation, which is synergistic.
Absolutely. No, I mean, advocacy is the sort of the first line of action that we had listed. But I would also take it forward and say with advocacy immediately comes going public, right? I mean, you can
the responsibilities, yeah.
That's right. Because sometimes we do expand the kind of things that we do in our own agencies, being architects and urban designers. We can expand that, but still we live within a certain kind of disciplinary circle. At Bengal Institute, we have decided we will go public, right? With go ahead, Rahul.
No, but that's exactly what I mean. So I mean, actually, the ideal situation is that we encompass all of that. That is, we have the ability to use those multiple lenses. We have the ability to filter those into instruments of advocacy, which is debate, conferences, discussion, the lecture series, and then we can extend that into action through advocacy and action. And therefore, then public is part of it. Now, that's the ideal. Unfortunately, in the profession, we get sliced down. And that's what's important about the Bengal Institute. I would say the UDRI, many other institutes, which are making these platforms that allow people to do those things simultaneously, which isn't.
I'll just give you an example, maybe a concrete example would be a good thing. We were invited to a town in the north. It's not really quite a small town, but obviously it's not a big city as Dhaka. Sylhet, I don't know if you know the name. Sylhet is up there. It's next to Assam, And we were invited there to do some very small urban design interventions, like street nodes and all of that. But we took that as an opportunity. Let's look at the city. We studied the city, and then we came up with some propositions from a kind of planning perspective and also developing urban spaces, especially riverbanks. I'm obsessed with riverbanks, for example. And we did some beautiful drawings and all that. But then again, the language of the drawings have to be such that it can go to the public. It's not for the entertainment of fellow architects or other people who say wonderful drawings. So no, visual language and textual language. We took it to the city and we did an exhibition. And and then we asked people in the town itself to come and take over the exhibition, and they were the one who were explaining to the people what can happen. It was a wonderful thing to see. They could have seen us as having arrived from the big city, and there could have been attention. There was no such thing. I think it was wonderful how the public was engaged. And one can say this has been now 4 years, and out of that, maybe some real projects may be happening, but that's not the thing. And at one point we thought, what's the point? Nothing has come out of it. But I believe that ideas circulate, percolate, and people
capacity
get motivated.
Builds,
Capacity builds, and that is happening. And yes, go ahead.
No, I think that's I'm glad you gave a concrete example. So therefore, I think the critical thing about the instruments for advocacy, because it has the word instruments and it has also advocacy. Advocacy is about connecting with the public. Instruments can be read in many ways because it makes the bridge to the profession and our peers, right? So instruments of advocacy, the good instruments of advocacy are the ones that can make that bridge, right? It's the way we define civil society, right? Civil society, at least in my definition, is that part of society that has the ability to both connect with the grassroots, but also negotiate with more powerful forces, correct? So therefore, labor unions, Bengal Institute, NGOs, trusts, foundations, these are all part of civil society because they do that. And I mean, I think to use Arjun Apudarai's idea of deep democracy, it really is that. And so therefore, I think we have to make greater alliances with civil society. What is happening is we otherwise either align with the powerful forces or we go to the grassroots, and then we have no agency because we don't have the bridge.
Right.
And therefore, I think these platforms are very critical. I'm only reinforcing what you're saying, that's all.
No, we have an agreement. The other thing, and I think something to think about also, going back to your reading of Salman Rushdie and as well as my reading of Salman Rushdie, and also thinking of this as a kind of narrative that should also come within the circle of our discourse within, say, urban design and architecture, which has happened that much. I myself have gone beyond my own circle and I've tried to engage with it. Perhaps it's because what you have suggested that it's a luxury, or we are hesitant. There is that, and I must admit, within the South Asian circles, such things are unnecessary or irrelevant, or only engage with it as a kind of luxury. I don't think so. Think so. That's what I mean by the missing narrative in our South Asian urban discourse. For example, Salman Rushdie himself, as we know, or other people talk about, has been influenced so much by James Joyce. And James Joyce is his first book, which is a masterly production in European literature, which I've tried to read 5 times and haven't gone beyond 5 pages. I'm talking about Ulysses, right? Which is, Ulysses is just a, meticulous description of the city of Dublin. The whole form of the book is like going through a city as a crazy city as Dublin, and then the details are about Dublin. And then James Joyce at one time makes a kind of arrogant announcement that if the city of Dublin were destroyed, you could reconstruct it by reading my book. So I'm saying that sort of relationship between representation and imaginary and the lived city. I'm kind of interested in that. So that's another lens. You mentioned different lenses. I think we need to bring different lenses. And it's also very important, I totally agree with you, just bringing the different lenses is not good enough. Bridging the lenses, and that needs a different kind of creative capacity. And how then we can go on to a next round of urban thinking.
And actually, I mean, that's almost, I'm happy to talk longer, but it's actually a wonderful and evocative concluding note to at least this part of the conversation, because I think where we both come in agreement, and I think it's in total agreement, I think, and I think it's also partly to do with, our backgrounds, our involvements with institutions and all of that, is that really metaphorically and literally, it's these bridges, these bridge practices. I'm not calling them bridge disciplines. These bridge practices between different disciplines is going to be very critical for the future, not only in South Asia, but elsewhere. And one can hope that triggers like the pandemic, and this is something you and I have both known, felt, written about, been vocal about even before the pandemic. So we have to kind of hope that some things like the pandemic actually trigger off these kinds of impulses within a much larger body of professionals and practitioners.
Absolutely. And I think that was the reason why we formed Bengal Institute, because having gone through formal academic institutions, both at home and here in the US, no matter how advanced some of the thinking and the productions are here in the US, but nonetheless, the disciplines stay within track. There is, despite talk of interdisciplinary conversation and all that, it's not happening. I have seen that it's just full of resistances for whatever reasons, controlling your turf and maintaining your regime, no matter what. So I think that so in some cases it's happening, but in most cases people are staying on track. And then, and you will agree that the disciplinary formation is maintained also by really oddly and ironically by the licensing board and because you have to have this kind of courses, you can't do that sort of thing in a very ironic way. So the disciplinary isolations are maintained. So I think how to get out of this is then to do something on your own.
No, so, yeah, correct. No, and I think that's a good.
Right. And personally, Rahul, let me just say this. Personally, well, I'm trained as an architect in its all formal glory, if you like. And with all the people that I've met, the teaching and all that, and I was suspectful of that in my own intuitive way, and I wasn't sure what that was. But it then took a while to kind of mold myself away from that glorious path. And increasingly, this is my personal track, increasingly I've come to see that architecture must have a conversation with landscapes, or in a disciplinary sense with landscape architecture, which doesn't happen. So that's one area I want to form a strong bridge between, right, architecture and
just
landscapes.
to come back, I mean, now that you touched upon interdisciplinary work, and I'm not just trying to, in conclusion, connect with some of the earlier questions that you put on the table, which, you know, has to do with the pandemic and what is a post-pandemic world. But now you've brought in this new category of interdisciplinary challenges, which is, I think, very interesting. And your own personal recap of it. And I think that's the other kinds of thing that, if we both agree that these bridge practices across disciplines are going to be more the need of the hour, and how does one create the formats or the conditions where this happens, again, the pandemic can become an interesting trigger, because really good interdisciplinary work actually happens also in the ways we define the problem. Because if the problem is defined in a way that no one discipline is privileged in the way it might respond to it, then it also depends on other disciplines, right? And that's the interesting thing in the way you framed architecture, landscapes, and settlements, because architecture as from the autonomous object, which is dependent on much larger ecological dynamics, suddenly feels helpless within that. It needs and depends on it. And, you know, just on a personal level, to recap my experience, because this is another reading that I've shared with you, from where some of the writing about ephemeral urbanism came, which was our project on the Kumbh Mela. That's the single biggest lesson that I learned from the Kumbh Mela project was not about the Kumbh Mela, but was about how, when you have a problem like that, so, you know, when I took people from 7 disciplines there, including business, management, and sciences, and public health, and architecture, landscape, but the anxiety of going to that place to map it, no discipline had a response. And it was very interesting that every discipline had to depend on the other one to just like, what does that mean? I mean, how do we understand that? How do we understand this? And so when it really, I think that is another big role that civil society, I'm imagining in institutions, and when we talk about these bridge practices, I think formulation of the questions and the challenges is as integral as addressing them, because otherwise, it's, as they say in simple ways, you ask the wrong question, you'll get the wrong answer. And I think that's, again, a big role institutional structures like the Bengal Institute, but also a lot of us who are interested in these kinds of bridge practices should be very mindful of.
I think we should have titled our video series "Bridge Practices," which is what it is, because I think this conversation is so important. But I think we can talk a little bit about your project on Kumbh Mela. The ephemeral,
mapping the ephemeral megacity.
Mapping the ephemeral, which is so important, so critical. And when you mentioned this a couple of days ago, and you sent me that article or the writing, and it made me think about a few things. And if you allow me, I'll just mention that, and then we can have a discussion. Now, well, on the one hand, you have the kinetic city, as you have talked about before, and then you have the ephemeral. And I think the kinetic and the ephemeral are kind of related. They're kind of the same sort of purposeful practice in 2 different contexts. And many of the kinetic productions are also ephemeral, if you like, even within the context of Mumbai or the streets of Dhaka. Right, but then there's the static, especially with the kinetic. You set up the kinetic, I will not say against, but in front
Binary.
or error binary. So I was wondering if this is a binary, if this is a duality, if this is oppositional, or here I will stop, or a clever intertwining, a mutuality between the political infrastructure, which is the strategic, and the lived practices, which is the tactical.
Well, you've
Much to
asked
be
the
said.
question and you answered it also, sort of. But I think what what I'll do is I'll just use that as a way to kind of go back also to some things that you raised. So, in this, this has got a little bit of a personal history, which is interesting and important because it also shows one's own thinking in the context of many things that you've said, Kazi. So, when I did this thesis using Salman Rushdie's work, and I titled the thesis One Space, Two Worlds. So there's a kind of inherent binary there. Then I went back to Bombay and I started working there. And I think I rewrote the essay for some magazine or for a lecture or something. And I made the one space, two worlds into, I defined it more and as the kinetic city and the static city. And I did this as a lecture for a long time. And then Andreas Hassan, who wrote the book Urban Imaginaries, heard my lecture and he asked me to do an essay. So that was the first time that time I just started teaching at Michigan, and I forced myself to think more rigorously about what I was kind of using more provocatively. And so then I used the title Interrogating the Kinetic and the Static City. So therefore, I think you're totally right. I was trying to intertwine them to blur the binary in a sense, correct? And then over 10 years of writing and rewriting that text and using more examples, I just dropped the word static city and I said the urbanism of South Asia can be described as an urbanism in flux, and therefore it's kinetic, and our cities are kinetic cities. The static has, little to do, right?
So
Then
more kinetic and less kinetic. It's just the difference of being
exactly,
kinetic.
exactly. And then what the Kumbh Mela did to my mind was it made me take city, which is linked to what you were saying, urbanization and action and growth and crisis and how do you deal with it. And I took city and I made it urbanism because one realized that one must look at this more critically and broadly. And one took one took kinetic and made it ephemeral. So it became ephemeral urbanism as a rubric, which I felt was it was more robust as a rubric to critically interrogate new forms of urbanism, some of which are ephemeral, but ephemeral on different time scales. So the Panwala or the market is ephemeral on a 24-hour cycle. A mining town is ephemeral on a 50-year cycle because when the resource goes, it disappears. So it allowed me actually to actually what it allowed me to do was to bring the imaginary of time into imagining cities, because we forget time, because we forget the temporal scale. And so I think that is the short history. So it
Right.
really, I think your reading of the way you framed it is absolutely accurate. I've just placed it within a personal history of how the terms in my own experiences evolved. And this is again linked a little bit to the idea of working in Mumbai, because one was interrogating the city continuously. In the first 10 years I was there, it was all crisis mode. It was all urbanization, right? When I had the luxury to come to your conference and as like Rip Van Winkle, wake up and then begin to engage with teaching and begin to see the city with a little distance and have the fantastic luxury of going away from the city for 6 or 8 weeks to teach here, to go back, one began reflecting on it differently. And so my relationship then to working in Mumbai began to change, which is what then reflects in the writings, which I have more recently done. So that's really the more personal history to place your comments.
Absolutely. In a kind of uncanny way, we are doing something also at the Institute. Last year, we were invited by the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism to do an installation. And I think the title was The Collective City. And what we did, or my colleagues, Marina Tabassum and Salahuddin Ahmed did, and Salahuddin was the curator of the show, and I'll share you some of the images, was looking at what they called, and they were the one who articulated that the invisibles of the city. They're right before your eyes, but they're invisible. They're the one, in your sense, they're creating the kinetic city. But also we argued that they are the micro-urbanists, because little by little they're changing the fabric of the city. The Panwala, and there was this beautiful document of this young girl sitting on a sidewalk with a sewing machine and just catering to customers, and then she will take the sewing machine away and that's gone. Well, of course, on the one hand, you will say that's a disruption to the public realm of the city and all that, from the urban policy position, that might be the case. But I think there's this sort of, and here I'm also careful of if all this sort of kinetic or invisibles narrative also betrays a structural inequity that our cities have,
exactly.
right? So one got to be careful about that. This micro-urbanists, and I think, so from there to people like you or me who are in one level or another doing more, say, organized, formal, or disciplined
we are discerning the patterns of the invisible to make them part of the discussion. So one of the kind of criticisms, and the reason I did that book called Ephemeral Urbanism, which followed up from the mapping of the ephemeral megacity, was the criticism that, so are you imagining all cities to be ephemeral and temporary? And that's not the point. The point is that how do you make the invisible visible enough that you can productively make them part of the city, correct? Rather than not imagine them. Right. And so that's why I'm almost 20 years later going back to the essay title of interrogating the static and the kinetic city as being the more relevant one, because that tension, we have to accept that tension and make that tension work productively.
Now, because from the same observation of a city or city situations like that, one could say, as people talk about Dhaka, we have talked about Dhaka, it's a disaster. The city is a disaster. That's one narrative. On the other hand, if you start to look at this micro-urbanist situations, it's a dynamic situation. It's powerfully dynamic. The kind of sort of life, energy, and sort of the generation of activities that the cities have, that keeps the city moving.
Yeah, Kazi, but I think, just to play devil's advocate, my position on this, so I don't have to. It's actually finally, I think finally it's about minimalizing risk. And I think the more safety nets we put in cities, the more static the city gets. So the things that you and I are cautious about over celebrating the invisible or over celebrating the kinetic city are that we know that there are implicit risks and insecurities with that. And then finally, the only way we can justify it in our minds, and the way we can justify informal economies and all of that, is the choice between survival and not survival, right? So to survive, you are willing to take some risks, whether they're risks of public health or they're risks of safety,
I know,
etc. Yeah. And so that this becomes a complicated question, and the reason I'm bringing this up, and maybe this is a good note to end it on, the reason I'm bringing this up is precisely what you started the conversation off with, is how do we understand this urbanism? How do we even begin to write the South Asian city? How do we begin to create these imaginaries which are not about crisis only? Imaginaries which will allow us a philosophical framework where we can address the precise moral questions about the trade-offs between survival and risk, and what does that mean? And how is that a collective risk? It's not a risk only of the poor and the rich are totally insulated from it. No, then it leads us to questions of social justice, inequity, and all of that. And I think it's only by beginning to grapple with those hard questions, using these multiple lenses that you and I have discussed, will we be able to really understand that urbanism to inform forms of urbanization. Otherwise, urbanization is going to be ahead of us, and we are going to be doing rearguard action.
Right. I'll just boil this down as a question which we don't have to answer. It's actually summing up, but as a question that what is the, or what can be the structural thread between the kinetic and the static? If the static is the citadel of capitalism, and if kinetic is an insurgency, and they're happening simultaneously, it's not happening that one after another. So I would just suspend that question in there.
Pick it up another time.
Pick it up at another time. I think we can't avoid this. In most cases, we do avoid this. I mean, we in a big sense, broad sense. But I think if you and I are working in the realm of activism, this is something that we have to, and this is kind of a part of our urban imaginary. Yes, okay. So, but I was reading your article on the Kumbh Mela again, and I just thinking that is incredible. Kumbh Mela is one example, but you know there are other fantastic contemporary models of such ephemeral, disciplined way, or if you call it discipline, and maybe as you said, condensed in time, creating a kind of quasi city. And I just list you some examples, and let's see what you think. One is the Hajj, you know, the annual Hajj in Saudi Arabia.
Well, Hajj, Burning Man, there are many.
Right. I was Burning Man. Burning Man is incredible. In fact, there was an article again in the New York Times. This person has been following the Burning Man for like 20 years, and how things have evolved from something totally spontaneous and wild to more disciplined, right?
Yeah. So Kazi, these are. So these are all, so the book that followed maybe you haven't seen it, but the book that followed the Kumbh Mela, it's exactly the same size as the Kumbh Mela. That book is called Ephemeral Urbanism. And what we did, so what we did in that book, which would be interesting for you to look at, is that we created a taxonomy. So we said that they are ephemeral landscapes of celebration, of religion, of transaction, of extraction, of conflict, of military, and I think there was one more maybe, of religion, I said, celebration, etc. And we created this taxonomy, and we took about 250 cases, so everything you've named, and 248 others.
Okay, I'm sure.
To organize it, and try to organize it in this taxonomy, because so ephemeral landscapes of religion are quite different from the ephemeral landscapes of extraction or of transaction. They work on completely different temporal scales. And what we did was we basically argued that the problem that these ephemeral landscapes, or the invisible, as you say, are not taken seriously in planning discourse is partly a representational problem. And so therefore, how does one create a metric that can bring it into the planning? So for example, Burning Man, my students, I don't know how they did this, but from very high resolution Google images, we actually made AutoCAD drawings of the whole city. So which means I can now calculate.
Which year? It depends on that.
Yeah, it was the last cycle, but it was, I'll tell you, this book was out 6 years. So yeah, it's about 7 years ago, whatever. So the point is that from that, then one can measure density, the amount of road space, public space, you know, you can do. So you begin to even take those landscapes and bring those metrics to bear to understand them on a temporal scale. So that was the exercise. So if you, I'll try to, we don't have a PDF, but I'll try to get scans.
I'll take a look at it, but I don't know if there are a couple of other examples are in your book, or it may be in a revised edition. The other one is the Ijtima gathering that happens in Dhaka every year, which is again the religious gathering.
Cows.
No. The Ijtima is the religious gathering. It's like the Hajj, like the Kumbh Mela. There were 2 million people gathered, 2+ million people gathered there every year. And the image is remarkable. That happens in the north of Dhaka near a riverbank. The riverbank is basically an open area, nothing much. And the government has given that area. And then you have 2 million people coming in there every January or February, I think it's in January. So that's 2 million, you know, it's one of the biggest congregation of Muslims
So we
in the
have it
world.
listed, but we
Okay,
didn't study it,
okay,
but we have it
right,
listed. It's in the
right.
list. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so that's in the religious category. But then there's another one, I would say, landscape of urgency, which is the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar,
Yeah.
which is another. I mean, there are other camps all over the world, but
But see that
particularly the
this
Rohingya
camp
camp.
wasn't there when we did the book, but
No,
last semester I worked with with an MDes student who did a
right,
thesis on the
right.
Rohingya camps. Yeah.
So we are doing such a few things in the Rohingya camp. There are a few camps, but the one in Kutupalong is the biggest one.
Yeah, biggest one.
I think there are about 6 lakh or 5 lakh people there.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I've
It's
been looking at those images. Yeah.
so we were invited to go there by one of the international agencies, and I went there with some apprehension because I would be moved by the conditions that the people are in. And we walked around. We spent the whole day. It's incredible.
It's incredible.
Rahul, I must say, it's incredible on the ground that, wow, this is a city. If you can
Yeah.
just for a while forget that these are refugee, persecuted people who have come in, but now for various reasons, the government itself and the other international agencies and the NGOs in Bangladesh have gone in and helped them set up a quasi, semi, and according to the government's description, it is impermanent. It cannot be permanent. Officially, according to the United Nations, it's a refugee camp. But, it has all the ingredients of a beautifully organized town. I must say, it sounds ironic. I have seen other small towns in Bangladesh and in India. They are unlivable.
Yeah. So these are these incredible spaces.
That's right. Oh, right.
And this was just this was, I think, just the summary of it.
But just if you can, Rahul, if you can just hold on to that. Well, that's a street, there are houses, and if you notice those vegetation, those initially those were not allowed because vegetation means rooting yourself, which then the government said no, you can't. But then people are doing in-house farming, and then you have the street, right? Commerce, right? And of course, there are the community fish ponds, and then the setting up shops, little public spaces. So what we earlier called ephemeral or invisible, this is all like totally there for you.
Yeah, but they also went and spent time there and got fantastic drone imagery. And so the last 6 months, one has been very engrossed with the Rohingya camp.
And Rahul, I say this for one reason. First of all, perhaps even we can learn from the Rohingya camps, even though it was organized in a kind of consensus between various agencies. The density of the camp, I had just noted it down. If I'm not wrong, or if my facts are correct, the density of the Kutupalong camp is 43,200 people per square kilometer.
Wow.
The density of Dhaka is 27,900 persons per square kilometer. The density of Mumbai, if I'm not wrong, and this shifts depending on what are the parameters, is 21,000 persons per square kilometer. Right. Okay, now if the camp works, and if the camp is, can be seen as a model of urban formation, you can, if you reverse the numbers, and you can start thinking about footprint of the city. And you don't have to build towers. There's a number of things that one can decipher from here or discuss about densities, public health, public space, city footprints. Yeah, something to think about or talk about.
Wow.
Yeah. Maybe lastly, Rahul, we spent quite a bit of time. Quite a bit of good time on the ephemeral infrastructure of the city, or the kinetic city, which you mentioned about the festivals of the city. I think especially in Mumbai, the Ganesh Chaturthi festival, right?
Yeah.
And something that should be also looked at closely, festivals, rituals, and myths that animate and activate a city, which also in the conventional or normative narrative of the city, in the urbanization business, it's not entertaining. Uh, and I was thinking of one example, of course, your example, and in Dhaka, we have the Pohela Boishak, the Bengali New Year, and then you have the Ekushe February, which 21st February, which marks a language movement day. The whole way that people, at the end of the day, people animate, activate, and create a whole invisible infrastructure, as I'm saying. It's something quite remarkable. And maybe lastly, I'll mention a book by, if I'm not making a mistake with the name, Niels Gottschow, who did work on
Niels
Bhaktapur. Bhaktapur, wonderful. So there is one
AARP papers.
That's right. No, which is incredible. I read it like 20 years ago. But he mentions Bhaktapur well as the physical city, which is by itself is a wonderful physical sort of, meandering streets, low buildings, but it's not a regularized city in a sense, very irregular, organic. But that's one city. But then he argues that every year with the festival, where the processions come out, and the processions go in a certain route, and the processions activate or bring visually alive for the people who are participating in the procession a mandala. A mandala doesn't exist, but the mandala is activated by the processions, and then mandala, not quite the more pure geometric form is activated through the ephemeral actions or activities of the people. That's, I think it's a wonderful thought. So there are the cities are played out or activated or animated in different ways.
But this goes back to, this also connects very well. No, I totally agree with your description, but I'm saying it also actually connects to something very important you had raised in the beginning, which is about relationships. So what it does is it alters and creates new relationships through that dynamic moment. So it's a form of disruption. You can read it, but what comes out of the disruptions are new formations of relationships, which don't exist in the business as usual kind of existence. So it's a positive disruption. They also become, in the case of the Ganesh festival, it becomes a forum for the subalterns to also express their own creativity, whether it takes on a political dimension. So in the Ganesh festival, you have those tableaus which they decorate, and in the tableau, it's always a political it has featured all the way people from Sachin Tendulkar to Mr. Ambani, depending on who's being celebrated that particular year. And so it also becomes,
as well as Durga Puja in Kolkata.
Exactly. So I mean, Durga, all of them are the same. And so I think what they do in Durga Puja also does that by creating the temporary mandaps. It brings communities in different relationships and formations together for those 10 or 12 days. So.